Hey buddy, where is the Garden of Eden? Some people believe that the Garden of Eden was in Egypt, and evangelicals believe that it was in the United States for some reason. I've even heard people argue that the Garden of Eden was on the planet Venus, or in a different dimension, or even on a UFO. The story of Adam and Eve is almost certainly not literally true. Most Bible stories are just poetry, metaphor, and allegory. So Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden probably didn't exist as they're described in Genesis, but there is a lot of real history in the Bible mixed in with all of that fiction. A lot of the people and the places that it mentions really existed, like the city of Jericho, for example. You know, the city that had its walls collapse with the blowing of the shofars? Historians thought Jericho was fiction for a really long time, until archaeologists finally found the ruins of the city in 1868, along with its collapsed walls and everything. So even though the story of the Garden of Eden is probably fictional, Genesis spends a lot of time describing the layout of the region of Eden. Genesis describes the commodities that were common in the area, like gold and onyx, and it tells us that it's opposite Egypt, meaning east of Egypt in the direction of Assyria. And it even gives us by name 4 different rivers that feed the garden. I think that the garden itself probably didn't actually exist, but if Eden was just some imaginary place that was made up just to tell us the story about Adam and Eve, then why did the Bible spend so much time describing the region, describing its layout? And why would it give us the names of those rivers? Those names had to have meant something to the people who were familiar with that region. And I think that that's really good evidence that Genesis was describing a real place. The concept of the Garden of Eden is a lot older than the Abrahamic religions. It originates from Mesopotamia at least 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, but it might be a lot older than that. The book of Genesis was written using ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts as references for their creation story. So the version of the garden story that we get in the Bible is a second-hand account that's fairly different from the original legend. The original Sumerian authors for the garden myth likely had a specific region in mind when they were creating this story. This was a Mesopotamia-centric religion after all. So the people of Mesopotamia likely believed that this story was describing a very real geographical location that they themselves were familiar with. And I think that the way that Genesis describes the garden also keeps it in the same Mesopotamian location. The Garden of Eden is a story about a paradise that freely grew food in abundance, allowing its inhabitants to live easy lives. A utopia for hunter-gatherers, which is perfect poetry for a region like Mesopotamia, where its inhabitants were famous for having to work really hard to grow their crops. The allegory is that there used to be a golden age before agriculture was necessary, when our ancestors were more innocent and they lived much more easy lives. Nature provided everything that they needed to survive. But then something happened. The environment changed, and suddenly our ancestors had to labor in order to grow their own food. The fall of man. Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization. Part of the reason it was so perfect for kingdoms and cities is because of the Fertile Crescent. Every year the land would flood, and the people of Mesopotamia learned to use these seasonal floods to grow their agriculture. Also because of their giant rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which have historically provided a nearly endless supply of water to the people of Mesopotamia. The term Mesopotamia actually means between the rivers. Essentially, the main purpose of the Garden of Eden story was to provide an allegory for how humans went from being wild hunter-gatherers who lived almost like animals to an organized, cultured society of farmers with rules and morals. Their belief was that we didn't know sin when we were wild, but we learned to understand good and bad, right and wrong, when we learned to cooperate and coexist in a civilization. The first hint that we have as to where the Garden of Eden might have been comes from the name. The Garden of Eden. The garden itself isn't actually called Eden, it's in a region called Eden. So to find the garden, we just have to find Eden. So where was Eden? What is Eden? In Hebrew, Eden translates to paradise. But that's not likely what Eden originally meant. In the ancient languages of Sumerian and Assyrian, Eden means desert, steppe, or barren wasteland. To the Mesopotamians, an Eden was an inhospitable land that did not support life. So the poetic beauty of the Garden of Eden is that it's a lush green paradise-like area that exists in the middle of a wasteland. The Garden of Eden is the garden in the desert. So there's our first hint. The Garden of Eden was probably some sort of a desert oasis, or maybe even a river delta region where there was an abundance of fresh, mineral-rich water. And this brings us to our possible location number 1, ancient Egypt. In a video I made a few years ago, I said that the Giza Plateau might have been built on the location of the Garden of Eden because there are people who have theorized that. But the Giza Plateau doesn't really fit the biblical description at all. First of all, there's only one river, the Nile, but Genesis says that there's one river that splits into 4 rivers that feed the garden. So if it's not Giza, then maybe it's that river delta region in the northern part of Egypt. You know, where Alexandria is? This is another popular location for the Garden of Eden, and it kind of makes sense. It's close enough to Mesopotamia that the original writers probably knew about it. And I mean, it looks good. It's a huge, lush green space with fertile land, perfect for farming, and it's being fed by one river that splits into multiple rivers. Kind of. Okay, it's not perfect. Actually, it's recorded in ancient times that the Nile River split into 7 rivers at the river delta. That's too many rivers. So the Nile Delta region is not really a good candidate for the Garden of Eden, but we are getting closer. Like I said, we should be looking for a region that's east of Egypt on the way to Assyria. Genesis 2 tells us the names of the 4 rivers that run through Eden: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Gihon, and the Pishon. We can see 2 of those rivers today running through Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And people are pretty sure that the Gihon is this river on the east. Today we call this the Karun River. But the 4th river is missing, the Pishon. People are pretty sure that that river dried up a really long time ago. So where was it? Genesis 2 tells us that the Pishon runs all the way through a land called Havilah. Havilah is the place that Genesis 25 tells us is opposite Egypt on the way to Assyria. So it's east of Egypt on the other side of the Red Sea. That's Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia doesn't have a giant river that runs all the way across the land and meets up with the Tigris or the Euphrates. Well, not anymore. There's a massive dried up riverbed that runs all the way across Saudi Arabia that the locals call Wadi Ruma.
This is the leading candidate for the Pishon River.
A wadi is a dried up riverbed that pretty much only ever fills with water during heavy rainfall, which can happen maybe once or twice a year in the Arabian desert. In the late 1980s, Dr. Farouk El-Baz discovered this dried up riverbed while studying satellite imagery. The wildest part about this is that the Wadi Ruma, the old Pishon River, appears to be much wider than the Euphrates River. I have no idea how a river this big would have been fed in Saudi Arabia and where the beginning of the river would have been, somewhere in the mountains, obviously. The point is that Saudi Arabia today doesn't receive nearly enough rainfall or snowfall to feed this river. But now we have our 4 rivers, and all of these rivers converge in southern Iraq, where they turn into a single river that feeds into the Persian Gulf. So if the area where these rivers converge is supposed to be Eden, then this place is Eden somewhere in modern-day Iraq. So the question is, where exactly in modern-day Iraq was the garden supposed to be? So this is the confusing part. The older English translations of Genesis make it sound like it's one river that then splits into 4 rivers that feed the garden. However, this idea comes from a mistranslation of Genesis. The original language uses confusing phrasing to describe these rivers. Rivers very rarely split into multiple rivers, usually multiple rivers converge into one large one. More modern translations of Genesis, like the NIV for example, do a much better job of describing this. What Genesis was really saying is that there was one river that fed the garden, which was split into 4 river heads. And a river head is the start of a river, or a place where the water comes from. So Genesis was actually trying to say that it was 4 rivers that merge into a single river that feeds the garden. So if this more modern translation is correct, then this probably means that the Garden of Eden was somewhere in southern Iraq. Probably somewhere in the region where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers meet. This is more or less a river delta, and it's usually the most lush and fertile area of a river. It's very possible that thousands of years ago, before Sumeria existed, this river delta region was much more lush with plant life and had much more fertile soil. This area could very easily have supported some sort of a paradise. Of all of the areas in the desert-like Middle East, a place like this would have been where hunter-gatherers would have lived the most comfortable lives. Another wild point of interest here, the Tigris and the Euphrates don't start in the exact same place, but their river heads are fed by the exact same watershed. Way up north here, where Iraq and Syria meet eastern Turkey. And this is along a large shield volcano called Karasa Dağ. So this place called Eden, the desert or the wasteland, could have been this entire area of Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. This Karasa Dağ watershed region feeds 4 major rivers: the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Khyber River, and the Baykil River. All of this is in eastern Turkey, north of Iraq and Syria. It's possible that these are the 4 rivers that Genesis is describing as feeding the garden. So there's a chance that the Garden of Eden was further north, maybe even north of Iraq. It's also worth mentioning that there are 68 different types of cereal grain that all have a common ancestor that originates in the Karasa Dağ region. Around Karasa Dağ, there's a huge shield volcano that had very rich soil, and it's likely that this is where a lot of agriculture originates from. It's possible that this shield volcano around Karasa Dağ is where the very first wheat was ever domesticated. And that's pretty interesting when you consider that this whole region might have been part of Eden, because after humans were kicked out of the garden, they were forced to develop agriculture. Well, what are the chances that 68 different types of grains all originated from this one region? Another thing that's worth mentioning here is that all of the soil around the shield volcano in Karasa Dağ is red soil. It's red earth. Well, Adam was formed from the clay of the earth. And in the original Hebrew, Adam is named for the type of earth or clay that he was formed from. Adamah. Adamah could be taken to mean red earth. So maybe the Garden of Eden was somewhere in Turkey instead. Maybe this red earth around the shield volcano in Karasa Dağ is where Adam was formed, and maybe this whole fertile region around Karasa Dağ was the Garden of Eden. I said earlier that that dried up riverbed that runs across Saudi Arabia might have been the Pishon, and people believe that because Havilah was described as being rich with gold and onyx and other minerals, and it just so happens that that part of Saudi Arabia is rich with gold and onyx. But further north from Karasa Dağ and that shield volcano in Turkey, there's another region that's famous for having precious metals such as gold that are regularly mined. This could also be where the garden was. I mean, I guess that could be true, but the problem with that is that it makes the description of the location of the Garden of Eden in Genesis kind of awkward. I don't really know that you could say that eastern Turkey, or even northern Syria and northern Iraq for that matter, are opposite Egypt or on the way to Assyria. I think that eastern Turkey is a good candidate for the Garden of Eden, but I think that it's too far north. But one last point of interest here north of Syria in eastern Turkey, there's a little city called Haran. Haran was home to the very first university ever founded. It was a center for knowledge, where you could consume knowledge. You get it? In the city of Haran is a tower that used to be used for astronomical observations. This tower dates back to the Middle Ages or maybe a little older, but it's rumored that this tower was built in the footprint of a much older tower. Some have suggested that this is the true location of the Tower of Babel. Now again, these myths and legends in Genesis come from much older religions in Babylon, Assyria, and Sumeria. All of these stories originally come from Mesopotamian texts. If these stories are describing real rivers, real lands, real regions, then it's safe to bet that the original authors of these original myths were placing all of these locations in Mesopotamia. Now, I don't know that we can necessarily find the location for the Garden of Eden, but I think that it's safe to bet that we found Eden, and I think that this is it. Eastern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, leading all the way down the Persian Gulf and Saudi Arabia. The cradle of civilization is the origin point for our creation myth. The people of Iraq are pretty confident, though, that the Garden of Eden was in southern Iraq, close to the Gulf. There's a park in southern Iraq that claims to memorialize the location of the tree of knowledge where Adam and Eve ate the fruit of knowledge. There's an old dead tree here that supposedly marks the location of the tree of knowledge. This obviously isn't the tree of knowledge. That tree would have disappeared thousands of years ago. But what if they're right? What if this is where the Garden of Eden legend originated from? What if this was the land of paradise, where an early group of humans lived easy, comfortable lives in a rich, abundant river delta? You're gonna have to let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much to my patrons and my channel members for supporting my videos. I could not do this without you. People who support my channel get to watch my videos in advance, and you also get access to exclusive content. Patrons and Ko-fi members also get access to the Armoured Skeptic Discord server. Again, thank you so much. I love you guys.